Hello, my name is Marcel Bogers.
And my name is Marisol Menendez.
And we are here at the 9th Annual World Open Innovation Conference in Eindhoven, in the Netherlands, at the high-tech campus. I want to be here very brief. Just want to introduce this panel on the value of open source, moderated by our very own Marisol. I'm not going to say much more, other than that I'm personally really looking forward to the panel, hearing different perspectives on this important topic, but then I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. And even you could stay because, you and I have such a great time talking with all these amazing people. And in fact, I'm really proud and happy because we've had conversations before. In fact, we've had World Open conversations before in our podcast, which, by the way, commercial moment, I recommend you listen to our podcast. It's great. Thank you very much, everyone. How's the inspiration so far? Are you already open innovated in your head? I really enjoyed the structure of this World Open Innovation Conference and the way that we are traveling from one topic to the other, and of course mixing and creating closer the distance between theory and practice, which Henry reminded us today that we are aiming to do in the conference. And this panel, I think it's a nice way to come back all together to discuss relevant topics. For those who don't know me, I'm Marisol Menendez. I'm a practitioner and open innovation fan since I discovered it in 2012 when I was appointed to do open innovation at BBVA. Global Bank, if you don't know it, we created the Open Innovation Unit, which ended up being quite large across the organization, a corporate function, and we've learned and lived the struggles of open innovation with the corporation. And I'm proud and happy to have this conversation about the value of open source with, you can see, this amazing panel. You are going to hear of them or listen to them today and tomorrow individually, but also we are here to talk and to open up. But just for them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit more about each other, I will follow like a random order because this is how we get things nicely. So I will ask first a newbie in the open innovation area. Henry, can you please introduce yourself? I think many don't know about you.
So people know me for my work at Berkeley and then maybe more recently at Lewis. But you may not know that for about 10 years I worked in the computer industry before I got a PhD and threw away my business career to become an academic. I think the business world was very happy to see me go, So in the process, I learned a lot about technology and innovation from the practical side of things, from actually doing it. I was in the hard disk drive industry. Yes.
Woo.
And my first product, this will tell you how old I am, the first product I helped ship contained 10 megabytes.
Wow.
That was the equivalent of 36 floppy disk drives. So a big step forward in its day. So talk about the value of open source. I got interested in this for several reasons, but one of them is sitting next to me here. Hilary Carter, the Vice President of Research at the Linux Foundation, and the Linux Foundation Research Advisory Board, which I was invited to join and was really pleased to be able to join. And one of the challenges that occurred from this is that how do we actually quantify and measure the value of something that is given away freely? And if you think about the excellent research that has been done by many of our academic colleagues in open source, most of that research has studied what I think of as the supply side, the people who contribute code to these projects. And the research has done an excellent job of explaining the motivations for this contribution, documenting the effectiveness of some of this and the growth that has resulted from it. And in talking with Jim Zemlin, the executive director of the Linux Foundation, and he's been there, I think, for 15 or 20 years, so he's seen a lot of the history of Linux and of open source. He shared with me the perception that those of us in academia that used to study open source and did some really excellent research on open source that was genuinely insightful, useful, helpful to the people in the open source community, his impression is that we academics have lost interest, that we've moved on to other new things. We've moved on to ecosystems. We've moved on to crowdsourcing. We've moved on to other great things, but open source is still alive and well. In fact, in some ways, open source has scaled way beyond where it was 20 years ago when some of the great academic research was coming out. So here we are where open source is truly making a massive impact across the society. But many of us in academia are not studying it anymore. Now we almost take it for granted because it's been so successful. So this also got me interested in this project. So what we're trying to do to measure the value of something that is given away freely, you can't track the market price, so we know that can't be the measure. And we know it's not just the supply side of people who are contributing to it. There's also a question of what I think of on the demand side. What are people doing with it? How are they using it? And in the approach that we're trying with the survey, we're trying to explore what would they have done if they couldn't have used open source? What would they have done instead? And that we might be able to measure and kind of triangulate a measure of value. So some organizations would have built the code themselves. And there are models out there for this many lines of code. You can estimate about this much money to do the development. And then there's further costs for support and maintenance ongoing afterward as well that we sometimes forget about. So that's one way to get at this. Another thing they might have done is they might have just gone out and bought a commercial product that had more or less the functionality that you were trying to achieve through open source. And those companies are only too happy to tell you how much it would cost to do that. So that's a second way we can measure. And in some cases, you can get to a next best alternative. If we can't do this or that, we can do a third thing, and perhaps we can measure that. So there's going to be no single measure of value out of this initiative, but there will be, through these three different perspectives, a way of triangulating on the value. And we are not through the analysis yet, but we had successfully fielded the survey, and we have 439 responses. And it's already clear just from the descriptive statistics that the value is quite large, quite significant. There are some organizations, interestingly, who think that it costs them more to use open source than it would if they did it themselves, and they still use open source. So these are some of the corner cases that get my interest. Why would somebody spend more money to use open source than they would spend if they did it themselves? And the answer seems to be, it's already done. The code's already there. That ongoing support and maintenance will be provided not just by us, but by the community that serves and supports this. And yes, even if it's cheaper for us to do it ourselves, it's going to take time. These are busy people already working on other projects, and it's not done yet, and it's going to have to be served and supported once it's done. So even in those cases, organizations are opting for open source as well. And then the last thing I'll say is, those of you who know me know that I've not only worked in a company for 10 years, but I've been studying companies and how they innovate for the last 25 years. And I'm really intrigued by an organization like Microsoft that 20 years ago characterized Linux, and this is their term, not mine, as a cancer.
Oh my God.
A terrible disease that should be resisted at all costs. That same organization today is one of the leading contributors to Linux, to open source projects more generally. They even spent $7 billion to acquire the leading open source repository called GitHub. And they did it not to privatize it. They did it because they saw GitHub as the most direct channel to this amazing community of developers out there. And better to get more directly connected to them. And if you're Microsoft, $7 billion isn't so much money. So, with that, I'll conclude my remarks and let you hear from people who know more about these topics than me.
Wow, so we are talking about maybe buying time, no, and readiness. But as Henry said, Hilary, you have been alluded many times in this conversation. Can you please introduce yourself?
Certainly, Marisol, and thank you very much. It's an honor and pleasure for me to be here representing the Linux Foundation. I lead the research program at the Linux Foundation, which was only founded a year ago to articulate the open source project communities, the velocity of open source projects, the value proposition around why competitive organizations come together in open source project communities to collaborate and what kind of value they derive from that. And so through empirical research methodologies, survey data, building data sets, compiling data sets and analyzing those data sets, doing qualitative studies, we are, bit by bit, creating a library of insight about the open source opportunity, the open source paradigm. So I'll talk briefly about how we have tried to value this commodity. And very recently, last week, we hosted a summit for Linux Foundation members. We are a global, for those of you unfamiliar with the Linux Foundation, we are a global nonprofit organization, and we exist to host and sustain open source software, open hardware, open standards, and open data. And we are supported by member organizations all over the world. When we examine the code base that is hosted under the Linux Foundation and quantify the number of contributors to that code base, we have approximately 605,000 contributors across our project communities. And by assigning an average salary of what a developer would make on average around the world, multiplied by the number of code contributors, we have valued open source code under Linux Foundation to be approximately $26 billion, which exceeds Microsoft's total payroll. If we were a technology company, we would be the world's largest software company.
Wow.
But that only speaks to the supply side. And what we're very interested in understanding is the value that is derived from this code creation. And the reason this is so important is that these communities don't appear randomly, that code isn't, it may be free, but it is not created free. It is created through the energies and efforts and resourcing of our member organizations, the Linux Foundation team, and the developers themselves. This is not free. There really is no free lunch here. And so how do we nurture these communities and sustain them and provide support for our developers to carry out the incredibly important work that they are doing, particularly when it comes to implementing security fixes and bug fixes. Because a lot of our developers are showing up to build features, not to fix vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. And so this mission of securing software supply chains requires resourcing. It requires time. It requires a framework and a plan and a massive multi-stakeholder strategy. That we cannot do this on our own at the Linux Foundation. Our developers cannot do this on their own. This is a community-wide problem that requires a community-wide response. So as much as we are responsible for hosting this ubiquitous code that quite honestly underpins, to give it a sense of the scope of open source, underpins the global digital economy. Just to look at Linux, the Linux kernel is the interplanetary operating system running the world's largest supercomputers, the stock exchanges, the International Space Station, the Mars rover, our hearing aid devices, our dishwasher, our systems in our vehicles. It's significant and it's powerful, and it's not just an operating system. We now have code bases specific to artificial intelligence and machine learning. 50% of AI applications are using open source code from Linux Foundation in AI and ML, blockchain technologies, energy technologies. And so everything we do has a global impact. And so it is a responsibility that in hosting prolific code, that code is secure and safe. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Marisol, and over to Anne.
You talked about the crowd needed to develop and maintain and create this, which is your area of expertise. You talk about unleashing the crowds, and introduce yourself.
Thank you. I see open source as a collective action problem, and at many levels of analysis. There is the worldwide level where we need to talk about distribution of open source software throughout certain industries, but also at the community level. And so one of the research areas that I would love to see more done is this notion of open source software communities, which are not just the developers at Linux, but are Kaggle for algorithmic development, data science, or Stack Exchange, where there's all sorts of bug fixing. And so there's all sorts of communities that are out there doing open source kinds of things. And I don't think we really understand enough about these communities as a collective action vehicles. And so for example, we now know that a lot of the open source software projects have a heavy investment of companies. And so the independent individuals who used to be the Linus types, who were the radical, passionate heroes of yesterday, have been replaced by paid developers, and who are doing this as part of a job, and how is that affecting the dynamics of the collective action, that is to say, of the community? And there has been some research done, but there's so much more we need to understand. We also know that a lot of the open source software projects and these collective action communities are woefully misdirected towards very incremental change. That is to say, maintenance type of kinds of things. And that's left the innovativeness, the radical innovation that they were initially known for, that's left that to the sidelines. And we know some research indicates on GitHub that the radical innovation projects are the ones most likely to die in this current context of corporate-run open source software projects. And what does that that going to do, to this whole movement and understanding the dynamics behind that? And then another area of research that I really hope people begin to address is one near and dear to my heart, which is that I've observed that these collective action communities are terribly biased in terms of who is allowed to participate, who is encouraged to participate, who comes to the table to participate, and who stays at the table to participate. And so my personal research is on Kaggle, and we find, it's just terribly male-centric, and what we find is when we do some very in-depth analysis of the millions of records, is that you begin to see that women come to Kaggle at the same rate that men would in terms of their representation in data analytics, but they leave much quicker and in much greater droves. And when you study why they're leaving, it's often because they find that the kind of activities that they are being expected to perform are what they consider wasted time, because they're not engaged in developing algorithms or they're not that interested in developing algorithms to market another thing of toothpaste. They're much more interested, let's say, in social impact, or they're much more interested in community-driven activities or collaborative learning or that sort of thing. And so as a result, you get a sponsor like Google, who owns Kaggle, who are starting to rethink the whole concept of how do we teach and how do we encourage data science in the world, because they're worldwide, and what is data science in the world. And so those are, to me, some really important research questions that I would hope that when I'm circling back to Henry, who says, how come there isn't research in OSS? And I'm thinking, I really do hope we bring the cycle back and get some excitement going.
Wow. So we have many interesting topics to open up. First, I want to say for those who are following us online, please do write your questions down, because this right now begins the interactive moment of the session. So I don't know if we have any questions in the Zoom right now, or... Not yet? Okay. I want to kick off with the first question about this. So we are talking about the human side of open innovation today, and we talked about the value of something that is free and how we are bringing the people together to develop something that is also spread around, so big that it's a planetary system. You were talking about that. So my first question is about the governance. What are the elements that are involved in the value that is flowing across the relationships and the crowd activity, and generally governing this? I don't know, maybe, Hilary, do you want to open up?
I can speak to how we approach governance at the Linux Foundation, and that I think that is why a lot of projects will come to us, that code will be released under Linux Foundation, because we do provide a framework for governance. And essentially, that is how are decisions made around a given code base. What is the frequency for code release? How many participants have a voice at the table? And it is what distinguishes our open source projects from others notorious today in crypto assets, which have absolutely no mechanism resembling good governance in many instances. And we have critical failures in the market and socially. And so providing frameworks around good governance, technical steering committees, marketing committees, governing committees and boards, and deciding on things like budget, and leadership. And that's very important. Those are very important conversations to have. And so this is really what we stand for, is good governance of code.
When we were talking in the conversations, we also talked about manage the expectations and make sure that the roles are covered. Also like to assure that the relationships are running and flowing correctly, you know? In this sense, this contributes also to the governance.
I was going to say about the governance, I really appreciate Anne's comment about thinking of this as a collective action problem, because I think if we frame it that way, we can see both the opportunity but also the challenge. If we think back to a classic book, and for you younger scholars out there, you've probably not encountered it, but I encourage you to check it out. Mansur Olson wrote a book by the title, The Logic of Collective Action. And it's a lovely book because it summarizes some of the real challenges to get people to agree, and that collective action can break down. You can lose it. If you think about open source projects, there is previously on SourceForge, today on GitHub, there is a long tail of projects out there that were put up on the site, and there's only one person, the person who submitted it. There has been no other engagement on all those projects in that long tail. So that's a kind of collective action failure. Now, for some people, it's fine that it's out there and that's all they need. They're not trying to engage. So I'm not suggesting that each one of these is a failure. But it is the case that things that people could be building on, there are a few projects that get lots of engagement, lots of participation, sort of a Matthew effect, if you will. But there's a whole lot more that get little or no engagement. And so thinking about this as a collective action problem, I think, is a very productive way to understand both the opportunity and the challenge. And it also gives us, I think, appreciation for some of the governance mechanisms that are being developed and put forward by the Linux Foundation for organizing other kinds of open source projects outside of Linux, outside the Linux kernel, but bringing some of the processes, the mechanisms, the licenses, the committee and other structures that you've learned, and offering those for others, other organizations to learn from and incorporate. I think thinking about collective action problems helps us appreciate this as well.
Do we have any questions in the room? Anyone wants to add, comment? No? Well, we can continue talking ourselves. Huh? Yes? We have a question way over there. Francesco. We need to
Incoming.
practice.
Well, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, the debate. And my point is, I think that value of open source is not an absolute measurement, but it's always relative to something. And I assume that you are measuring just one point in time, right? With the survey to this 400.
Yes, correct.
And have you considered how this value is changing depending on the non-open or more closed platforms during the time? For instance, now how all this scandal with Copilot and OpenAI is affecting the value. Perhaps it's biasing how we measure the value. Perhaps next year the value is different. So my point is that how to measure it if it is in the end valuable. It's a valuable measure over time. Thank you.
So I'll start, but I would very much invite others to join in. I think the premise of your question is exactly right, that the way we write software is in the process of change. It wasn't so long ago that some of us learned languages like Fortran, where you sat down and you just started writing lines of code. One of the great things about open source is you can see the code. And so more and more software is built today by mixing and matching together blocks of code that somebody else wrote for some other purpose. but it does that function, and I need to do that function in my project, so I bring in that piece of code, and I start by just plugging in that code base. And then we kind of assemble the code instead of writing the code. And then we get to Copilot and other coding assistance mechanisms that allow us to sort of start something or say what we want to do, and then Copilot writes the actual code to do that. These are still in early stages of diffusion, I would say, but you can already see that the way that we have been writing code is going to change quite a bit in the next 5 or 10 years. And I haven't even gotten to Stack Overflow and other mechanisms for getting other people to either tell you how to do it or correct how you did it. That's another resource. That's a very communal resource that brings these expertises together. And so we still have somebody has to integrate it, and somebody has to stand behind it, somebody has to support it and maintain it in the community. But it is being done with new tools, new methods. And so when you do a survey, we're taking one snapshot in time, probably from around the summer of 2022, and we were surveying organizations of all shapes and sizes, but the people who responded probably were ones who were already more actively engaged with open source to begin with. And then what we're going to learn is from that response. So there are a lot of things that will be incomplete or missed. But any good research project is going to hopefully stimulate more research. So this is an attempt to try to bring some focus to this issue from the demand side. And my hope, and I think I speak for Hilary in this, is that others will build and take it further as well.
I want to add a question to this topic, and maybe for you guys to also build over, is this collaboration and this bringing the pieces together also opens up the challenge of security, of course, no? So what do we do with that? Who wants to talk?
Oh, this is the challenge of our time. It really is, because people's lives depend on secure software, because it is so prolific. It is in our operating rooms, it is in our aircraft, it's in the cars we drive, and the safety of our applications drives the security priority. Not that long ago, in fact, this time last year, we learned the Log4j vulnerability. Prior to that, it was Orion SolarWinds. And those vulnerabilities were pervasive and extraordinarily costly. If we look at the Equifax data breach and what that cost one organization alone, that's just the financial side. I think there is this human safety and security imperative, the integrity of our financial systems. The other reality we now face is, if we think about how war in Ukraine broke, security is the fourth arena of warfare after invasion by land, air, and sea. The first line of attack now is on our systems. That is how vulnerable we are as a society to infractions in code and exploitations. So I can't understate the urgency with which we need to address the security of software supply chains. A year ago, in May, the Biden administration issued an executive order that all software must be procured with a software bill of materials accompanying it, so that the government would know which components were in government systems. In the event of a vulnerability, we could quickly fix that vulnerability. So it is on the agenda of our government stakeholders. It is very much a priority all over the world. And so we have to come together to work together and try to fix this serious issue.
Yeah, and I undertook a research recently on this topic and the use of open software, for example, in banks. And there was this also like general knowledge that some software is more secure when it's open because you have more fronts for defending it. No, so That's also that interesting element there. We are getting close to the finish of this conversation. You can see that we would be able to speak for a long time, but I wanted to give Anna the opportunity maybe to give a closing idea or remarks about... do we have a question there?
Do we have anything from online?
Yeah.
Here comes the box.
Hi. Marcel, you're a sportsman. What's happening there?
Okay, so this is actually quite a long question. So this is from Yao Sun, an assistant professor in New Jersey. And he would like to say a big hi to Anne and thank her for letting him know that this awesome conference. As an eco-innovation researcher, I just wanted to echo Dr. Chesbrough and Dr. Majchrzak on their points about seeing open source collaboration as collaborative action. And I think figuring out contributors' knowledge-sharing dynamics is critical to this process. I wanted to hear from all three speakers about how they view the role played by knowledge integration in open source collaboration, and if there's anything that we could do to promote knowledge integration within the community to produce innovation.
Well, maybe the three, it's a high request. Let's begin with you, Anna, and see how far we can go.
Well, I think we had to take a step back, and I know we've only got a minute left, is the open source software movement has become so pervasive in our community that it affects people's, not just users' lives, but the developers' lives. In other words, you get a job or you don't get a job based on your performance in these communities. And if we know that these communities have deep systemic biases against people and against groups of people, that all we're doing by supporting these kinds of communities is continuing the biases. So I think as researchers and as practitioners, we need to take a step back and say, how do we govern these collective action communities so there's inclusion? And that's a big problem, because if we continue to develop software the way we're currently doing it in this pervasive open source way, we're going to continue to have very biased views about what the software can do, can't do, what contexts it can run on, what security issues are going to be solved. So to answer that question, Professor Sun, my thought is that we need to think very carefully as people concerned about open innovation, that we need to take some activist role in our research, in our practice, in saying that we need to encourage inclusion in knowledge integration and at least study it enough so that we know the extent of the problem.
We can just do a roundup of a quick tweet with your conclusion to wrap up the session, yeah? More than 140 characters, you can say a long tweet.
So my short tweet, to build on what Anne just said, is in addition to the issue of inclusion with the open source infrastructure that is being built with all this software, many of us are studying the artificial intelligence algorithms that are being trained on top of these data sets. So if we start with the foundation that is very good in some areas and completely myopic or limited or completely excluding other areas, and then on top of that, we then train the AI algorithms, I think you can start to see how this is going to compound. So it is a great time to get young minds engaged in how we do better.
We young minds will work on that. Sorry, Hilary.
Well said, Henry. And to build on your call, I will say the very first research project that I had the pleasure of being part of was on diversity, equity, and inclusion in open source, because it is imperative. And seeing through the advancement of existing programs, codes of conduct, mentorship programs, inclusive language, inclusive speaker training, scholarships for underrepresented communities to come to our conferences. These are critical mandates, and when we have inclusive communities, we get better code, plain and simple. So I want to cheer on all of those people who advance inclusive communities and thank them for continuing to build those bridges and encourage a new cohort of diversity in thought and representation, because it really does matter.
And you know what? Because diversity brings more value. So this would be good for the value of open source. Thank you very much, everyone. Would you like to take a selfie with the audience as a group? We can take a selfie, quick selfie, Marcel. You know I love selfies. Don't fall off, please. Don't fall off. Beware now, here. Are you ready to say hi, everyone? Okay, one selfie and one video selfie. Say hi. Hi. Hello from Eindhoven. Woo! We are ready to go. Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Hilary. So, Marcel, this was it. I promised you that this would be a really different recording of the podcast. But you know, we had this unique opportunity of having everyone together here in the same room. Yeah. We are energized, we are thrilled, we are inspired.
Yeah, and it's still only the beginning, right? I think we have so much to look forward to, and I think this has been great also with the conference to have those different perspectives from academic colleagues, from people working in practice. And I think this is the melting pot we try to create at the conference, here also at the high-tech campus, a melting pot of open innovation itself. So I think that has been very exciting, very interesting insights that we hopefully can build on in the future.
Of course, and well, we are talking continuously about this, but we are working really hard as a community to not have just this event, but we will continue the conversation, of course, through our podcasts, but also through all the many other activities that we are promoting around the community. So let's keep building the open innovation community.
Absolutely, and so we'll stay in touch with everyone.
Thank you very much, guys. See you in our next podcast session.
Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.